So with that 4-foot base, he has 8-foot ceilings in his house. However, like most homes, the back corner of the cubby that this is going into is about 8 foot, but towards the front it changes by almost 3/4 of an inch front to back. So the opening of the cabinet is taller than the back, which means the top rail for this cabinet, I'm not going to attach it in my shop. I'm going to keep it loose so that when I get to the site I can scribe this to the space and have a nice flush fit to the ceiling. Also, since these are frameless cabinets on bottom, they're just going to be edge banded on the side. I'm going to make my face frame larger than the cabinet. It's much easier to try and get this face frame the same width as my opening so that when I attach the side wings I have a nice straight line here than it is to try and get this cabinet the perfect width of here, especially since I can't mock it up in my shop. So the face frame is going to be bigger than this cabinet. And I'm also going to make this cabinet not as shallow, and that is because, like I said yesterday with that plywood, I don't have a lot of 25.5 piece sections left, which means I'd have to buy a whole new sheet of plywood to make this cabinet, or instead of making it that deep, I can make it about 23 inches deep. With the face frame it will be 24 inches, and you won't lose a ton of storage and it will save a lot of money. The face frame I actually think I'm going to make out of leftover plywood, just because he really wants everything to match the existing kitchen, and everything in the existing kitchen is made of that plywood. Like I showed you, the doors yesterday are made of that plywood, so instead of going and trying to find a hardwood to match, I could just make the face frame out of that plywood and edge band the sides, and it will still look good. So same thing as yesterday, I'm going to be cutting my two sides, putting rabbets on the top and the bottom, then cutting the top and the bottom. This one's pretty simple because it's just a cubby, and then attaching the back. I'm not going to explain a lot of that while I do it, because if you can make something like this, you can make another cubby. So I'm pretty much just going to film doing it and then add it to this video. One thing I forgot to mention, a quick change I made as I was cutting, and realized that if I made my cabinet 25.5 deep but was adding a 1/2 inch piece of ply on the back, that opening would only be 25. So these sides I ended up actually cutting at 26. I think I said in the beginning of the video I'd be cutting them all at 25.5, but luckily I quickly kind of realized that that wouldn't work, and these sides were cut at 26. So in order to make that box, the current space I have for that top is going to be 25.5. The cabinet I have now turned out to be 30 3/8 wide, and I have 32-inch height. But the box I'm going to be making is only going to be 31 by 30 and 22 deep. So I need 2 pieces at 30 by 22 and 2 pieces at 31 by 22. The tops that I'm cutting, the 30 by 22, I'm going to cut those oversized and trim them, because with the rabbets on the tops and bottom, this will end up being a little bit smaller, but I'm going to rough cut all these pieces out to start. So I have this cabinet laying down in my shop since I can't stack it to get some accurate measurements on height so I know what to cut that top rail at. And then since this one isn't as deep as the top one, I just kind of propped it up so it would be closer to flush when it's going to be installed. I also propped the cabinet doors that are going in place on here so I could calculate how wide my stiles have to be and how thick this top rail has to be based on the leftover opening. So with all that stacked in place, it comes to 90.5 inches. Plus the 4-inch base, I'm at 94.5, which means this top rail has to extend at least 3 inches over the top of that cabinet in order to get over 96 inches. Now the front side of that opening in the house is higher than the back side, so I'm going to about 97.5 just to give me plenty of space to scribe this to the wall. Also, those doors only come up about a little over 2/3 of the way of that opening, so from the top of my cabinet they have to come down at least 10 inches in order to rest behind those doors. Just to give myself some leeway, that's going to be 11 inches down plus the 3, so this is going to be a 14-inch piece that's going to be detachable. Then the opening in the center there is 5 inches, so I split that in half. They have to come over at least 2.5 inches on the edge in order for the doors to cover the opening, and once again I'm rounding that up to 3. I also made this cabinet a little shallower than the edge cabinet that's going to be frameless, which means that stile on the side can stick out a little bit. I'll calculate that for both sides. It's about 1/8 of an inch, so I'll have a nice straight continuous line here for my wings. So what I'm going to do now is usually I put the stiles on and the rails on the inside, but I don't want to have to scribe 2 stiles, the tops of 2 stiles and the top of the rail to the ceiling, which I would have to do if my stiles went all the way up and the rail fit between it. So instead of doing that, the top part's going to be one rail that comes to the edge, so I only have to worry about scribing that one piece, and the stiles will sit in between my 2 rails. This bottom part's only going to be 3/4 of an inch, because you don't want a huge lip between the edge of your cabinet and where you're storing stuff. So the way I like to attach my face frames is with splines. So before I put this together, you could kind of see it in the video, I cut this about 1/8 inch 3/16 inch groove, which will receive a masonite spline, and everything can be glued together. If you're not attaching your face frame and you're leaving it so it can be scribed, these are extra convenient because the face frame fits on there nicely without being glued in place. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut top rail and cut the bottom rail, put this receiving spline in place, and attach those. So I'm going to mirror what I did here and edge band these edges. It'll be easier than trying to veneer this inside. So then what I did was I lined this up and marked on the other side where that spline should be. I did the same exact thing for this one, but before I laid it on top, I don't know if you could see it, I put a 3-inch mark and then lined that 3-inch mark with the top of my cabinet, and then marked on the other side where my spline is. So now I can go cut that groove in this one and that one and attach those splines. Now these I actually made a little shallower than the width of the cabinet because I'm going to be edge banding these edges, and the edge banding on both sides together is about 1/16 of an inch. So they're a little bit thinner than what I need, but once I add those edges, they'll line up perfectly. So the material I use for my splines is just a sheet of masonite, and I just rip off strips. The strips for this one were about 1 inch. Then once I have those, I could snip them down to size very easily with aviator snips, and then they fit right in that groove. And the piece you cut can go right on top. Once that's glued into place, it's a super snug, secure joint. Now on this one, especially since I'm edge banding it, I can, when it's setting up, put some brads in there to hold it in place, and then you'll be edge banding it and covering any holes you have. Now that this is on here, you could see how nice and snug that is. I could start framing out the rest of this. And this piece, I'm going to, obviously, like I said, make it removable, but I could glue the spline in before I go to the customer's house. And the other 3 pieces I could have glued in place, so it'll be really easy to set up. So I measured the height of my sides here, and they're both 22 7/8, which is great. That means everything's still square, and they're going to be by 3 inches. So I'm going to cut down those 2 pieces out of this, more of this scrap ply, and then I'm going to line it up on here and do the same thing I did. I could take this one off, line that up where I want it, and mark where that spline's going to go, and then cut those splines and attach those as well. So with those sides in place, you could see that now the doors will cover that perfectly. And when it's laying in my shop like this big piece on top looks kind of odd, but in the space, this will actually not look bad up top. It'll be a nice break instead of having the doors come right up to the ceiling. Now, since these are overlay doors and they came with hinges, since there's such a wide face frame, I'm going to have to put some kind of spacer in the inside of this in order to attach the hardware. With those doors off, you could see how nicely all of my joints line up, and they're nice and square and flush. Now the splines for this, I cut the grooves and the grooves in the plywood a little loose. Usually I make them pretty tight, but that's because the clearances on here are so tight that when it comes time to glue everything up, I have a little bit of play in all of my pieces in order to severely line everything up. And you can see, since I flip this on edge, it's a little bit thicker than this. So when I add the veneer on it, it'll be much thicker. So I'm just going to have to trim about 1/8 of an inch off the front face of this. Now, I like to build things a certain way. I like to make them as strong as possible. And I find that these splines for face frames and installing them in a space are just like the easiest things to do, but they take longer to do. It's more work up front and less work during the install. I watch a lot of videos on YouTube myself, and something like this, these carcasses, you can make with pocket hole screws. Will it be as strong as this? Probably not. But once you attach it to the wall, and especially if you have this partition on the bottom, it's really not going to go anywhere with pocket hole screws. Same thing for the face frame. Face frames are great for pocket hole screws. You can line it up and put them together. The only problem with using pocket hole screws in this situation is it would be much harder on site to detach this top part, scribe it, and then put it back together. It is doable. This is just easier.